El contenido del siguiente programa es responsabilidad de sus realizadores. La Pedagógica Radio presenta Tablas y Tableros.
Un programa de la licenciatura en Artes Escénicas dedicado a la divulgación de los procesos pedagógicos, investigativos y creativos de nuestra licenciatura.
Estamos en Tablas y Tableros, un espacio de divulgación para la investigación, la creación y la educación en artes escénicas. Para el día de hoy tendremos a un invitado especial con quien nos comunicaremos hoy vía telefónica desde la isla caribeña de Santa Lucía. Hablamos del Dr. Travis Weekes, quien es actor, poeta, dramaturgo y crítico cultural. Actualmente Travis trabaja en la Universidad de las West Indies en San Agustín, en la isla caribeña de Trinidad y Tobago. El Dr. Travis ha publicado varios libros como Let There Be Jazz, Bodies, Memories and Spirits, The Fight for Bellevue y The Feel of Power. Les acompaña Eduardo Silva Peña, docente de la licenciatura en Artes Escénicas de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional. Este es el programa número 256. En la dirección tenemos a Alejandro Sepúlveda, en las comunicaciones Duván Cárdenas, en la producción radiofónica Yolanda Barrantes y Luis Bautista, y en el control máster Mario Alfonso Enríquez Romero. Les recuerdo que nos pueden escuchar a través de radio.upn.edu.co los martes a las 5 de la tarde y los viernes en repetición a las 11 de la mañana. También puedes encontrar todos nuestros podcasts en las plataformas de iBooks y YouTube. Bueno, entonces le damos la bienvenida al Dr. Travis Weekes. Thanks for joining us, Travis.
Yes, thanks, yes. The name is pronounced Week.
Week. Yeah? All right. Travis
yes.
Week.
Yes.
Ok, listo. Bueno, les cuento que el año pasado estuve en Caracas, Venezuela, en el Festival Internacional de Teatro Progresista, y allí pude presenciar una obra escrita y dirigida por Travis Week llamada Take Me to Mon Repos o Llévame a Mon Repos, pieza teatral que se ubica en el año de 1874 en la antigua colonia francesa de Santa Lucía, y se trata de un hombre esclavizado, Wigwan, quien tiene la misión de incendiar una plantación donde vive precisamente su pareja. Antes de la función conocí al director Travis, con quien conseguí el libro de la dramaturgia. En este mismo libro se menciona que esta obra presenta una ilustración de las dinámicas políticas, económicas, culturales y espirituales que contextualizaban el proceso de colonización en el Caribe. Quisiera hablar sobre este último aspecto, el cual se deja de lado usualmente en los procesos históricos de cimarronaje, y es precisamente el rol de las diversas espiritualidades de matriz africana que tengo entendido fueron centrales en los procesos de emancipación de las personas esclavizadas en el Caribe. Me gustaría que Travis nos contara sobre la importancia de la espiritualidad afrocaribeña en estos procesos de liberación de la esclavitud. Take Me to Mon Repos also highlights how the political, economic, cultural, and spiritual dynamics of the Caribbean shape the process of colonization. I'd like to focus on that last dimension, which is often overlooked in historical discussions of Maroon resistance, the role of African diasporic spiritual traditions. From what I understand, these spiritual practices were deeply connected to the liberation struggles of enslaved people across the Caribbean. Given your work in Bodies, Memories, and Spirits, I'd love to hear you reflect on the importance of Afro-Caribbean spirituality in these movements for freedom and emancipation.
Right. Thank you, Eduardo.
Okay, you are welcome.
Invited me to speak.
Excuse me?
Yeah. All right. So, yeah. Well, you see, the thing about it is that we're talking really about freedom, and not just physical liberation, but we're talking about spiritual liberation, emotional liberation, psychical liberation as well. And the most oppressed people in the Caribbean, in the New World, have been the descendants of Africa. And it is their impetus, their work, their drive for liberation that has really brought indigenous cultural practices, indigenous cultural forms, or if you like, let's call them Creole forms, Creole theater in the Caribbean. Because what they have done really is that they have used their own cultural material, their own spirit, their own gods, their own cultural forms, whether it is their drumming, their dances, their songs, their chants, They have used that in the effort at liberating themselves psychologically, spiritually, physically, emotionally. But how they have done that? They have done that by bringing as well the dominant cultural practices, say, of the Europeans, of all the classes that were dominant, all the good cultural forms and practices, whether it be the language, the European languages of Spanish or French or English, whether it be the European religion, the descendants of Africans, they have brought their own cultural practices to the dominant cultural practices, and they have transformed those practices. So they've created novel forms. They've created new forms and new practices in the drive for liberation. By using the elements of the dominant discourse, they have been able to penetrate the colonial spaces, the literary spaces, religious spaces, physical spaces, colonial centers, and so on. Because the strategy has been that we also utilizing and I'm speaking to the Europeans, to the masters now, we using your practices. Okay, you saying that we must speak your languages, whether it is Spanish or French or English, and we must practice your religion, Roman Catholicism, etc. Yes, we are going to do that, but we are going to bring our own practices, our own linguistic structures, our own semantic structures, our own lexicon. We are going to bring our own gods to your cultural practices.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we're not
Okay.
actually resisting any dominance, but we are creolizing the space.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what that has brought about so much powerful cultural forms and practices in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the New World, in North America as well.
Yeah. Ok. Bueno, Travis nos dice que efectivamente el proceso de descolonización que llevó a la emancipación no solo fue solamente un aspecto económico o político, sino también un aspecto a nivel cultural. Esta implica también un ejercicio de reapropiación y de exploración de las espiritualidades de matriz africana, ¿no? que viajaron pues, con los primeros descendientes de la trata esclavista. Y este proceso fue muy importante, por ejemplo, llevarlo al teatro también, a partir de lo que se denominó el teatro creol, que es una forma fundamental para recobrar estas historias y entender cómo en el Caribe el proceso de mezcla tanto de tradiciones culturales y espirituales fue fundamental para la emancipación de los procesos de la esclavización. Entonces, mucha de la resistencia de estas personas se basó principalmente en esta combinación llamada creolización de prácticas tanto culturales como espirituales. Ok, tengo otra pregunta, ¿sí? Y esta tiene que ver con los procesos creativos y la relación de la historia y el teatro. ¿Cómo solventas esta relación conflictiva entre la ficción teatral y los archivos históricos o coloniales, sobre todo en contextos postcoloniales como en el caso del Caribe? My other question has to do with the relationship between history and theater in your creative process. In postcolonial contexts like the Caribbean, how do you approach the tension between theatrical imagination and historical or colonial archives? How do you balance artistic freedom with the responsibility of representing histories marked by colonial violence and rebellion?
But thanks. Well, you see, the first thing is we're looking at periods. So, for example, if you look at the period 1794 to 1796, that was a very decisive period in Caribbean history. And to get the context, just before that, we had the French Revolution, say, in 79. Then we had the Boukman Revolt in Haiti in 1791. And by the time you had the Bookman Revolt, all the colonies, the French colonies in the Caribbean, were under duress, under stress, because it was not the same again. Because remember, the slogan from the French Revolution was liberté, égalité, fraternité, and that slogan filtered down to the plantation, to the mulattoes, but also to the African slaves, or the enslaved Africans rather. The first is to get the period. If you're using history in order to create theater, then you have to get what is happening, the context of the historical period right. Then, of course, there will be characters. There will be major characters at play. Now, you may not always have the exact characters but you will certainly get representations of the characters. So what I mean is, for example, we know definitely that we had freedom fighters, that we had Maroons, that we had enslaved Africans who took to the hills. We know we had leaders among them who had to negotiate between European powers, whether it is between the French and the Spanish, or the French and the British, or the British and the Spanish, etc. We had leaders out of the Maroons who had to do that. So the way the creative imagination works now is that we have to recreate those characters. We have to bring them to life. I sometimes say basically that what we're doing with the writing process is that we're seeking souls. Yeah, we're seeking souls. It's imaginative, but it's also a very, very spiritual exercise. Yeah, and then we're recreating those characters from that period. And the important thing is, when we talk about recreating characters, because we're talking theater, we really have to show human beings on stage. So although characters might seem to some extent abstract and literary, but really what you're doing as a playwright is that you want to present human beings of that time, of that period. You want to present them on stage. So it means that in terms of the creative imagination, the creative process, you have to give realistic attributes to those persona, those characters that you're creating. You have to make them believable. You have to create full characters, not just types. So you have to create characters who are courageous, but who are also vulnerable, because these have to be believable. And in so doing, you engage them with their struggle, with the opposition, with other characters that they're fighting or were fighting with them. Then you also have to think about their own personal life, because they're human beings. They're not just fighters, they're human beings with personal relationships, with wives or husbands, perhaps with children, etc. So it's actually very exciting, the creative process, because you go into a historical period, you want to represent what happened during that historical period, but you also want to create living, breathing human beings that your audiences can relate to, can look at. So when your audience look at them on stage, they can see human beings in action.
Okay. Okay.
Because of the process, we're also talking about, there's so many complexities. The language that they speak. A while ago I spoke about the Creole form, So the language itself is a creative process, because you don't want always to have them speak in the standard European language, but you want to recreate a language that would have the linguistic complexities that represented the times as well.
All right. Bueno, aquí nos cuentan que, pues, para entender esta relación entre historia o historia archivística e imaginación teatral, por lo menos en el caso de esta obra, tenemos que situarnos entre los años de 1794 y 1796, el cual fue un periodo decisivo tanto en las islas del Caribe como en la Francia, de la cual muchas eran colonias. Recordemos que la Revolución Francesa ocurrió precisamente por estos años y tenía una frase que era libertad, igualdad, ¿sí? Liberté, égalité, y fraternidad, las cuales eran un poco las banderas que se retomaron en las rebeliones de independencia en el Caribe. Hay que anotar también que estas revoluciones caribeñas no se pudieron haber dado sin la agencia de algunas personas esclavizadas que se constituyeron en una suerte de cimarronaje, ¿no? Unos rebeldes que se integraron entre estos procesos, ¿cierto? Y sin la cual no hubiera podido llegarse a este proceso de emancipación, donde, por ejemplo, pues hubo también intervención de abolicionistas, pero la historia oficial, ¿no? Relata un poco la postura desde esta perspectiva sobre todo en lenguas hegemónicas, esto es en lenguas europeas como el francés o el inglés. La importancia en el proceso de creación de estos personajes, por ejemplo, estos cimarrones, se da en un proceso creativo donde hay que brindarles a los personajes una serie de atributos realísticos, donde, por ejemplo, hay una especie de almas hablantes, ¿cierto? En donde la historia se presenta de otra manera. Esto es una historia encarnada, una historia relacionada con los cuerpos que están presentes, tanto de los actores como de los espectadores. Y de esta manera se puede también, por ejemplo, contar una historia en lenguas propias, ¿no? Las lenguas creoles propias del Caribe tienen un sentido epistemológico diferente al de las lenguas tradicionales europeas. En ese sentido, el teatro se convierte en una de las mejores opciones para presentar o representar una historia en un contexto actual, en un contexto donde son los cuerpos los que encarnan estos procesos históricos. Bueno, ¿de dónde vino la idea de hacer una obra teatral sobre la esclavitud y cuál es la importancia de escenificar estos temas hoy? What drew you to explore slavery through theater, and what possibilities does performance offer for revisiting these histories today?
Well, I mean, there's an educational dimension. That's the first thing, because remember that we have not really written our stories, our history. It took a long time for us to do that. The history was written by the Europeans, and because of colonization, that history was imposed upon us in terms of the lens. We were looking through the lens of the Europeans. Yeah. So the first thing now is educational in terms of we now writing our history. And if we're doing it through theater, that is fine. And so we're educating our people about our history from our perspective. We're telling our stories and not having the stories told for us, so that our people can be educated and become more sensitized to our own efforts at liberation, but also what we did, the communities that we created, our own heroes. That is important. Yeah, our heroes, the communities that they created, their languages, their songs, their prayers, their chants, right? That is important. The other thing too is that by doing it in theater, through theater, by researching history and then using the genre of theater to transmit that history, we're also ensuring a continuity in terms of performance and live performances, so that it's less abstract. It's not just history in a text, but through performance, that history comes alive. And so when we write text, and when we, through the dramatic process, when we stage those plays, we are leaving behind examples for succeeding generations, so that they can themselves represent that history, perform again that history, and see it live and present it live for succeeding audiences in times to come. That is very, very, very important. But also the other element is that the other artistic elements in terms of costuming, the music, the dance, the dances, all these are also very, very important, because these act as instruments of empowerment. Yeah,
Okay.
instruments of empowerment for actors and for successive generations of performers. Yeah,
Okay.
by embodying the spirits of the characters, they become empowered.
Ok, bueno, a mi modo de ver, la importancia de estas historias de la esclavización a través del teatro tiene tres propósitos fundamentales, el primero es el propósito educativo. Eso pues tiene un valor sin igual, ya que antes de la colonización, estas comunidades, tanto las que vivían originalmente indígenas en el Caribe como la gente esclavizada que vino de África, traía un bagaje cultural y un repertorio de prácticas fuera de la escritura tradicional alfabética. Entonces, este proceso de contar historias por fuera, por ejemplo, de la escritura europea, es importante para las personas, para los espectadores de hoy. Por otro lado, es necesario investigar la historia para transmitirla en una cercanía caribeña que fue de alguna manera colonizada a través de la historia contada por los mismos europeos a través de los libros y en sus lenguas, ¿no? Sabemos que la educación en estas islas, en el periodo de colonización, se lleva a cabo por las instituciones educativas y dejó de lado la oralidad predominante de la gente local y de las culturas populares, ¿no? Entonces, las lenguas, los cantos, las danzas hacen parte fundamental también de la manera de contar historias en estas islas caribeñas. Y un tercer elemento que nos señalaba Travis es el elemento artístico, ¿no? Tener la oportunidad de recrear el vestuario, las danzas, ¿cierto? Eso da una suerte de oportunidad de empoderamiento para construir historias locales y para revisionar, ¿cierto? O revisitar la historia contada en los libros. Ok, ahora quisiera hablar del teatro caribeño en general. Para quienes hemos explorado la literatura, el teatro y el performance caribeño, la figura del Premio Nobel de Literatura Derek Walcott de la isla Santa Lucía precisamente es ineludible. Cuéntanos primero cuáles son las características y urgencias fundamentales del teatro caribeño y qué importancia tiene la figura de Walcott en tu propio trabajo creativo. Now, I'd like to shift the conversation toward Caribbean theater more broadly. For many of us who have been explored Caribbean literature, theater, and performance, the figure of Nobel Prize-winning playwright and poet Derek Walcott is impossible to ignore. To begin, could you talk about the fundamental characteristics and urgencies of Caribbean theater, and also about the importance Walcott's work has had in shaping your own creative practice?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the way in which we've utilized the dominant European theatrical conventions for our own purposes. It is what we know. We were taught the theater of the Greeks, Shakespeare, the neoclassic, from Spain as well as France, etc. So all that was imposed upon us, right? So, but what we did was that we took the theater of the street, the theater of the yard, the masquerades, the rituals, these of the Caribbean, these that came from the colonized people, the Africans, the Indians, etc. Right? We took these and we transformed the theatrical conventions of the West. Right? And this is what Walker did. He started off with, he was very much influenced by the Greek theater conventions, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides. He was influenced by these. However, growing up in St. Lucia, the street theater of the masquerade, the carnival, the storytelling, the rituals. That was also very theatrical, and it was right there on us. So we took that and we brought that to the Western theatrical convention, and that is where the power of the theater of Derek Walcott lies. The language in particular, he recognized the poetic in the French Creole language, or in the Creole language of the Caribbean. That is the languages that were created in the Caribbean out of the encounter between the Europeans and the colonized peoples. And that language realized the poetry in it and utilized the poetic elements in the indigenous languages. And he used that to energize the dominant European languages, and that gave his discourse, his dialogue, his poetry, his verse drama, that gave it tremendous power, because it is a craft that he had to create. He had to utilize the linguistic varieties of the Caribbean to create a powerful discourse that represented the Caribbean.
Okay.
And so it's been a very important model for me in that regard.
Ok, bueno, la oportunidad que nos dio Derek Walcott de enriquecer las formas teatrales tradicionales europeas, la tradición clásica, por ejemplo, Shakespeare o el mismo Sófocles, fue que Walcott le enriqueció a través de formas rituales y teatrales preexistentes, como decía anteriormente, en estas comunidades, ¿no? Por ejemplo, el teatro de la calle, todo lo que sucedía en los patios de las casas, que es una tradición muy caribeña, ¿no? El carnaval, el ritual, ¿cierto? Las prácticas de la gente colonizada, ¿no? Los caribeños, también la gente de la India, configuraron una creolización de todas estas formas, las cuales impregnan toda la producción artística de estas islas y del Caribe también continental. Hablamos, por ejemplo, del diálogo, la poesía, ¿no? El drama, y son unas formas que revigorizan la tradición teatral occidental, pero que se apropian, ¿cierto?, de una manera muy fructífera en el Caribe a partir de una creolización que es también una forma de rebelarse contra las dramaturgias y el canon tradicional europeo. Ok, finalmente vamos a hablar ahora de la última producción en la que has venido trabajando. En español, No me llames muñeca o Don't Call Me Baby Doll. Esta obra también tiene estas características del teatro caribeño. All right, so let's talk now about your latest production, Don't Call Me Baby Doll. Does this play also reflect some of the key characteristics of Caribbean theater we have been discussing? And for those who may not know the work yet, could you tell us what the play is about?
So Don't Call Me Baby Doll is about two Hispanic migrants in Trinidad, a Cuban migrant and a Venezuelan migrant. They are both female, both women. They migrated to Trinidad because they were fleeing the economic poverty from their own countries, that is Cuba and Venezuela. And so they came to Trinidad to seek a better life. But one of the characters, the Cuban character Maria, her eyes really was on migrating to the U.S. And she wanted to do that by leaving Trinidad and going across South America, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, etc., and then crossing the Mexican border. So these two, they were working in Trinidad, they were illegal, and they were both arrested and placed in a holding cell. So they actually met in a holding cell in prison in Trinidad. It so happened, though, that one of the characters, the Venezuelan character, Isabella, is very, very seductive and knows how to get away with men and so on. And she was able to seduce a guard, and it is true that they both were able to flee from the prison cell and end up on the coast of Trinidad, that Las Cuevas, where they were waiting for a boat because there's always a illegal ferry moving between Venezuela, between Guiria and Las Cuevas or Malacas. And they were waiting for that ferry in order to get to Venezuela. Isabella wanted to go to Venezuela to see her family because she left back 2 children there. And Maria wanted to go and meet her boyfriend, who he was also Cuban, but he had went ahead of her and was trying to make it across the border to the U.S. But a couple of things happened. At the time that they had those dreams, Maria had those dreams of entering the U.S., that was during the Biden era, when Biden had offered that kind of facility for Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, etc., Nicaraguans to get to the U.S. However, it was during the process Trump won, and Trump stopped that migration. And so because of that, the girls became frustrated. To make it worse, by the time they get to the border, to the coast, Las Cuevas, to try to make it to Venezuela, by that time Trump had already sent his ships on the waters off the coast of Venezuela, etc. And the ferry, that stalled the ferry, and so they were waiting for a long time. So they began to despair. So that is the basic outline of the story. But what is really interesting is what happens inside the prison, how we get to know these characters. We get to know their own stories from where they came from. We get to know Maria and her own struggles in Cuba, Isabella, her own struggles in Venezuela. We get to know about their struggles in Trinidad when they were working in the bars, the prejudice, the discrimination, the sexism, their battles with the males, with the state represented by the police, etc. And so we get to know the inside of these girls, and also we get to see them become close and develop a sisterhood and a camaraderie while in prison, and a solidarity towards their own liberation. And the journey becomes not just a physical liberation, but a liberation, a psychical liberation, a spiritual liberation, a liberation where they get to understand more about their own selves because of the hurdles that they were facing. So, but the form that is presented in is I use a lot of ritual and movement and dance and poetry and storytelling and drama and conflict and role playing, etc., and music, in order for that entire story to come out. And I think that is one of the reasons as well that this play has been so successful. So yes, it also represents Caribbean theater. It represents Caribbean theater because for a number of reasons. The language, I had to spend some time getting the language right, because these Hispanics in Trinidad, they speak English, but it's not standard English. They create an English that is influenced by Trinidad Creole, influenced by their own varieties of Spanish that they came with from Cuba and Venezuela. Yeah, and the play is also very critical of Trinidadian society, not just because it's Trinidad, but we're looking at migrants, and migrants face very similar issues no matter where in the world that they are. So it really is also a story about migrants and societies and the states, the complexity of the states in terms of the attitude towards migrants and the challenges that migrants face in any society.
Ok. Bueno, esta obra, No me llames muñeca, se trata principalmente de un grupo de migrantes en Trinidad y Tobago que son de origen hispano, ¿no? Hablamos principalmente de cubanos, venezolanos, que pues por condiciones económicas han tenido que viajar a la isla a veces de manera ilegal. Y en muchos casos, estas personas ilegales son arrestadas por agentes de inmigratorios, tal como sucede en los Estados Unidos. Y así tenemos pues personajes como el de Isabela y el de María, que tiene un novio cubano y que de alguna manera en prisión crean una especie de hermandad entre mujeres donde buscan una especie de liberación espiritual, no solamente física, a través de pues, manifestaciones en casos llaman sincréticas de todas las espiritualidades del Caribe, ¿no? Asimismo, ante la pregunta sobre qué características del teatro caribeño tiene esta obra, hablamos de que se incluyen, por ejemplo, músicas que son propias del Caribe, como el dub, ¿cierto? Se incluyen también ciertas referencias a espiritualidades del Caribe, como la santería, etcétera, ¿no? Y que pues esta obra es de vital importancia ahora, pues cuando las políticas, sobre todo de los imperios, han reforzado sus políticas anti-inmigración, ¿cierto? All right, we hope to have the opportunity to see Don't Call Me Baby Doll in Colombia someday. Finally, for those who are interested in Caribbean theater and literature, is there a website or online platform where they can explore your work and learn more about your place?
Well, maybe not a website, but there's a lot of information. I have on YouTube, I've done a series called Theater Classics of the Caribbean. So I can send you this, and you can, and there are a number of plays that we discuss, classical plays in the Caribbean. So that is available. These discussions are available on YouTube. And on my Facebook page, I usually post a lot of pictures and information about my plays. So that's Travis Week, my Facebook page, and maybe some on Instagram. That's it. You can get a lot of information there on these platforms. Yeah.
All right. Ok, bueno, seguramente en las plataformas de YouTube podemos encontrar algunas páginas como Teatro Clásico del Caribe, Teatro Clásico of the Caribbean, y también en la página de Facebook de Travis Week, y también en la página de Instagram. All right, okay, Travis. So the time is up. So I would like to thank for your time, for generosity in terms of your words. Thank you very much.
Yes, you're very, very welcome. And I was really happy to meet you when you in Venezuela, when you saw Take Me to Monrepo. And yes, and I would very much like to share with you Don't Call Me Baby Doll about Hispanic migrants. I think it's something that you will really appreciate and that Colombians will find very interesting. So I look forward to seeing you again, Eduardo.
Okay. Hope to see you again, Travis. Okay, a hug. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Ok, bueno, esto fue todo por hoy. Esto fue Tablas y Tableros, el programa de la licenciatura en Artes Escénicas de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional. En la dirección tuvimos a Alejandro Sepúlveda, en las comunicaciones Dubán Cárdenas, en la producción radiofónica Yolanda Barrantes y Luis Bautista, y en el control máster Mario Alfonso Enríquez Romero. No olviden que pueden escucharnos a través de radio.upn.edu.co en las plataformas de iVoox y YouTube Podcast. Una vez más, gracias por su compañía.
La Pedagógica Radio, una década tejiendo voces, construyendo saberes. Quédate con las voces y los sonidos que enseñan de la Pedagógica Radio.